On the 9th of September 2025, Russia issued a challenge to the NATO alliance. Over the span of a single night, Russia flew over 20 unmanned drones into Polish airspace and forced the nations of NATO to defend their own collective airspace against an active threat. This was the first time this has happened in the alliance's 76-year history. The incident rattled NATO's leaders to their core, and not because it was a surprise, but because Russia's intentions were immediately clear. It was precisely the attack that NATO had been waiting for, that the alliance knew was coming eventually, so that Russia can find out whether its pledges of collective defense are real or simply an old, tired charade. NATO must react to Russia's provocation. And although an early response is already underway, the actions we're seeing today simply will not be enough. NATO doesn't have to attack, it doesn't have to end up in a war with Russia, but it does have to do something in order to demonstrate that these sorts of provocations will only harm Russia's own interests. The alliance has ample tools at its disposal, and today we're going to explore some of the responses that NATO or its member nations could select. But either way, that choice has to be made as quickly as possible, because it won't be long before Russia decides to see how much more that it can get away with. To understand just why the NATO alliance needs to act, we've got to understand two things: the sequence of events that went down in Eastern Europe across the last week or so, and the deeper reason that those events constitute a major problem. As for the events themselves, it all started on that night that we mentioned at the top of this episode, September the 9th into the 10th, when, over the course of about 7 hours, several small swarms of Russian drones violated Polish airspace. Early that night, the drones had seemed as if they were part of a major swarm participating in an attack in western Ukraine, not far from the Polish border, which isn't an uncommon occurrence over the course of Russia's ongoing invasion. The problem, however, was that those drones started moving into Polish airspace. That's something that might happen very occasionally when individual drones seem to lose course and wander over the border, but for entire groups of drones to fly over the border, that's another matter entirely. The nation of Belarus, where the drones were launched, warned Poland ahead of time that the drones were coming, blaming electronic warfare countermeasures by Ukraine. But frankly, that excuse was far from believable, especially considering that multiple groups of drones separated by multiple hours continued to fly across the border long after Ukraine had confirmed it was aware of the crossings. The drones that performed the incursion into Polish airspace were from an ultra-cheap line known as Gbura, made with little more than styrofoam and a simple propulsion mechanism. They are decoys, and although they can sometimes be loaded with explosives or reconnaissance equipment, their primary role is to soak up air defense interceptors and clear the way for more dangerous drones to move through while air defenses are reloading or tracking too many targets at once. As such, these drones didn't detonate on Polish territory, but they did fly deep into Polish airspace. One destroyed the roof of a residential building, another one ended up in somebody's yard, and a third landed on a base used by Poland's territorial defense forces, basically a national guard. Polish fighter jets scrambled to respond and monitor the drones as they flew, working with the help of Dutch F-35 stealth jets and the military aircraft of other NATO allies. Luckily, nobody died in the incident. A few days later, a Russian Shahed 136 kamikaze drone flew into the airspace of Romania, also a NATO ally, while Polish and NATO warplanes had to be scrambled in order to guard against another attack in western Ukraine, where drones flew very close to Polish territory. In an episode that we published here on WarFronts just last week, we explained that Russia would deny that the attack was an intentional provocation. It would minimize the incident and seek to redirect blame. As it turns out, we were right, and Belarus even got in on attempts to explain the incident away. But as we said back then, and as a chorus of international experts have confirmed, the incident was almost certainly intentional. And even if it wasn't, that doesn't really matter. Over the last several years, Western defense leaders have repeatedly explained that they operate under a clear set of assumptions about Russia's behavior. That Russia, under Vladimir Putin, seeks to threaten the nations of NATO that were once under Soviet control, and that sooner or later, Russia would engage in probing actions that would allow it to measure whether the NATO alliance really intended to honor its commitments to collective defense. Under NATO's Article 5, an attack on one member state is an attack on all, and that principle would, in theory, stop an outside aggressor from attacking any NATO member. But in practice, the NATO alliance is bloated, averse to confrontation, over-reliant on the United States, and under-equipped for a 21st century conflict, meaning that there's a real possibility that NATO might not actually engage in collective defense if it was challenged. So, according to those same Western defense leaders, Russia has been planning to engage in probing attacks that would be significant enough that on paper they should trigger a NATO response, but vague or technically harmless enough that NATO members could find ways to wiggle out of that collective defense obligation. If those member nations fail to respond to a mild provocation, Putin learns that he can engage in mild provocations whenever he wants. Then he pushes to medium-sized provocation to see whether NATO will also find a way to wiggle out of that one. If Putin is successful again, NATO's logic holds that he'll keep on climbing that ladder of escalation until finally he can march troops into Poland or Finland or the Baltics while the alliance just stands aside. So that's NATO's logic, but it's also a logic that NATO has shared publicly again and again for years. It's a set of assumptions that has motivated NATO's entire push for rearmament, led its militaries to start reinvigorating themselves, and forced Europe to reduce its dependence on the United States. And according to the same story that NATO has spent years telling itself, if Russia were to hypothetically fly more than 20 drones into NATO airspace and then deny any intentional wrongdoing, then in reality, that would be a coordinated and planned Russian test of NATO's resolve. For all practical purposes, it doesn't actually matter whether the events of last week were a Russian test or an accident. NATO has spent too long repeating the idea that if this were to happen and NATO were to back down and fail to respond, then it would be a signal to Vladimir Putin that NATO was weak. So in a weird but oh so very real way, NATO no longer has the option not to respond without sending that exact message. Again, the vast majority of international conflict analysts who can speak freely on these issues agree that it almost certainly wasn't an accident at all. And even if the drone swarms were a genuine accident by Russia, it's not as if Vladimir Putin and the Kremlin would ignore the opportunity they accidentally created to study NATO's response to something NATO already committed to interpreting as an intentional provocation. After the drone swarms in early September, NATO rapidly initiated the first phase of its response, Operation Eastern Sentry. A quick response force of NATO fighter aircraft took positions along the Polish border, including 3 Rafale jets from France, 10 Eurofighter Typhoons from Germany and Britain combined, 2 F-16s from Denmark, plus a naval frigate for air defense, several Gripen jets from Sweden, and Patriot missile defense systems from the Netherlands. Those joined F-35 stealth jets that were already forward deployed to Poland or the surrounding region, and they'll soon be accompanied by more F-35s from Norway and special operators from the Czech Republic. Ukraine agreed to host Polish defense officials to bring them up to speed on the best anti-drone responses, and Poland presented an emergency briefing to the UN Security Council and was backed up by a number of allied representatives, and Poland then closed its border with Belarus during the course of a pre-planned set of military exercises done jointly by Belarus and Russia. NATO leaders have indicated that over time Operation Eastern Sentry will integrate additional warplanes and spread its coverage from the Baltic Sea in the north to the Black Sea in the south, also covering Romania, Bulgaria, and the 3 small vulnerable Baltic states. But although this early response by NATO is certainly meaningful, it comes with some critical limitations, and quite honestly, it just doesn't go far enough. NATO has indicated that it's reacting to Russia's provocation, and in doing so, NATO leaders have proved that they aren't completely asleep at the wheel. But a mere reaction isn't the same as a response. If somebody's trying to pick a fight with you, and you react by ducking under their first big swinging punch, then good, you didn't get hit. But it's the response, the way that you choose to strike back, that decides whether the other guy is going to keep swinging or start looking for an opportunity to walk away. Right now, the NATO alliance is in that same situation, and while Operation Eastern Sentry is a perfectly fine reaction, it would be a massive mistake to let this go without a response. Alright, now as we start to explore the options at NATO's disposal, we've got to set some parameters, including this one for all the pro-Russian accounts that will inevitably accuse us of warmongering in the comments. Listen oh so carefully. The only responses that we will discuss today are responses that are explicitly chosen because they do not involve any action that Russia could reasonably interpret as kinetic, wartime aggression. None of the responses that we will discuss will involve any exchange of fire with manned Russian military assets. Not a single Russian life will come under threat through any of these options, and none of the options that we discussed today would involve positioning NATO assets on the front lines of the Ukraine conflict or opening any other front lines where the war could expand. Every single option that we are going to discuss, we are discussing because they do not involve any act of real warfighting aggression by NATO member nations. That being said, it's also important to understand the limitations of the idea that NATO should avoid escalation at all costs. NATO should avoid violent escalation at all costs, and it should avoid creating a confrontation between its own soldiers and Russian soldiers unless absolutely necessary. But if NATO is going to respond to Russia instead of merely reacting to Russia's provocation, then NATO or its member states have to take some sort of action that raises the stakes. The goal is not to simply avoid escalation. After all, if NATO isn't willing to escalate, then Russia has nothing to fear by just trampling all over the alliance. Instead, the goal is to escalate proportionally in a way that addresses the specific threat that Russia presented while providing Russia with options to end the cycle quickly and painlessly before it goes any further. By flying its drones into Poland, Russia asked a question: can we get away with this? And now NATO's job is to say, no, you can't. Not by screaming, not by throwing a fit, not by whimpering and rolling over. In an ideal world, NATO's response is firm, clear, and convincing, and it has to walk a very fine line. NATO has to be obvious in its response. It has to act predictably so that Russia can see its actions and decide what to do. And it has to make clear to Russia that the wisest course of action would be to refrain from these kind of provocation in the future. But instead of just discussing abstractions, let's talk specifics, shall we? Starting with a set of options that would take the work that NATO's already doing with Operation Eastern Sentry and build that initial reaction into a real response. Eastern Sentry is an air defense operation, and there are ways to keep NATO's response rooted firmly in the act of air defense while taking a more creative interpretation about just what airspace needs defending. Here, the most conservative option would be to take NATO's static air defense batteries like its Patriot systems and position them at or near the Ukrainian border while simply allowing them to defend the airspace in their full effective radius. Officially, the Patriot's maximum effective range is 160 kilometers or 99 miles, meaning that if a battery were positioned exactly on the Poland-Ukraine border, it could handle incoming threats up to 99 miles into NATO territory. NATO isn't positioning any military assets inside Ukraine. It's strictly deploying air defense systems to react to Russia's violation of NATO airspace, and if a drone or missile comes within range of those batteries, then of course it should be interpreted as a threat to NATO airspace, considering that drones within that range have threatened NATO airspace very recently. Taking that same set of principles, NATO can start incorporating other potential elements to a response while still justifying its actions firmly as an act of air defense over its own airspace. NATO aircraft flying over NATO territory can leverage standoff munitions to shoot down drones or cruise missiles that enter their range, meaning that if a NATO fighter jet can lock on to a Russian drone, that drone has come too close, no matter whose airspace it happens to be flying over. Alternatively, NATO can establish a clear buffer zone, deciding that because of Russia's actions, Russian drones simply can't be allowed within, say, 50 kilometers of NATO airspace, and then enforcing that rule. Helping things along and reducing the risk of accidents, NATO nations can close down a portion of their airspace. That would force non-military flights to divert around a buffer zone, with the added benefit that this would place noticeable pressure on Russian commercial air travel while still being too minor an inconvenience for Russia to justify making a scene. Or if NATO really wanted to get a bit spicy, it could even extend its active air defense mission over parts of Ukraine. Again, there's a spectrum of options that NATO could choose from. A less escalatory option might be to secure the airspace above western Ukrainian cities like Lviv and Lutsk, close to the Polish border, while a moderate escalatory option could be to commit to protecting Ukrainian airspace west of Kyiv, where, by NATO's assessment, there's simply no reason for Russian drones to be flying unless they were trying to pose a threat to NATO airspace. Or if NATO really wanted to send a message while remaining firmly within the realm of air defense, it could establish a buffer defense near the war's front lines and lock down the rest of Ukrainian airspace because Russia can no longer be trusted to wage its air war without posing a threat to NATO. As extreme as that last option might sound, it's an option that the nation of Poland is already calling for, with Polish Defense Minister Radoslaw Sikorski calling for NATO to enforce a no-fly zone over most, if not all, of Ukrainian territory. Whether or not that sounds like a good idea, we'll leave it for you to decide, but it is an option that NATO member states are already floating. In fact, it's an option that Ukraine has been calling for across the last 3.5 years of war, giving NATO all the pretext it needs in order to claim that after this provocation over Poland, enough is enough. Now, we would be remiss not to mention the major problems with simply extending NATO's air defenses over parts of Ukraine, or even relying on air defenses in the way NATO's already doing under Operation Eastern Sentry. NATO only has so many missiles and interceptors for its air defense, especially in the event that the United States decided not to participate in whatever response NATO decided to pursue. Not only that, but those defenses are expensive, and they are an order of magnitude more expensive than the drones that Russia used to threaten Polish territory. Remember, those those drones were made mostly out of plywood and foam. They are extremely cheap to produce, and Russia doesn't particularly care if they're shot down. In practice, NATO would have to be very careful about how it plays its hand, because if it commits to defending a certain airspace and Russia decides to threaten that airspace, Russia can very quickly draw NATO into a financial trap. NATO can bankrupt itself, firing off expensive missiles, or it can back down and show itself to be too cowardly to actually make good on its threats. That said, NATO could decide that it might be worth playing that game, at least for a little while, and finding out whether Russia could back down without ever getting into that battle of expenditures. But the potential drawbacks are still worth emphasizing. Now, of course, NATO has plenty of options that would go well beyond a strict commitment to air defense. In fact, some of NATO's potential responses would address that very issue, perhaps by pouring money into the creation of production lines for the same kinds of much cheaper air defense options that Ukraine relies on. Those options, for example, building cheap drones meant to take out cheap drones, were already worthy investments for NATO before Russia flew its drones over Poland, and now they are even more worthy. NATO member nations could solicit the help of expert Ukrainian drone makers, or even funnel their money into production contracts with Ukrainian companies, footing the bill for an expansion of Ukraine's homegrown defense industry. If Ukraine can't spare the production capacity, then perhaps defense contractors in NATO nations could be convinced to collaborate with Ukraine more directly, pitching in their own ideas and using their assembly lines to build Ukraine's products instead of just their own designs. Or NATO could move away from air defense entirely and engage in other actions to place pressure on Russia without risking the start of a continental war. NATO could take a more active posture in targeting Russia's shadow fleet, the tankers and bulk carriers that Russia uses to get around Western sanctions. Imagine a world where those ships were actively interdicted whenever NATO ships encountered them, or where NATO positioned warships at the mouths of the Black Sea or the Baltic, of course allowing all legitimate vessels to come and go as they pleased, but stopping Shadow Fleet ships whenever they attempted to move through the same zones. That would put NATO into murky legal waters, but considering that Russia is more than happy to around with that same grey space, NATO could afford to help Russia find out about the potential consequences that come with throwing out the rulebook. Also on the water, NATO nations could begin more actively patrolling the seas around the Russian exclave of Kaliningrad, positioning warships just outside the bounds where they'd enter Russian waters, or in an alternate universe where NATO was willing to act boldly, traveling through those Russian waters from time to time. If NATO wants to slow cook Russia while leaving Putin ample time to rethink his actions, the alliance could surge money into new defense initiatives where work can start today but would take years to complete. Or if NATO wants to send a really clear message, it could announce the construction of new military projects, even entire bases in border zones near Ukraine, Belarus, or Kaliningrad. That could include major projects in and around the Suwalki Gap, the thin stretch of NATO territory between Belarus and Kaliningrad that Russia could conceivably threaten with a limited ground invasion. Begin the slow but very obvious work of building new base infrastructure, and NATO can place pressure on Russia, but it can also leave Russia the option to make that new construction go away by changing its behavior and agreeing to meet NATO's terms for mutual de-escalation. We've also got to distinguish between the actions that the NATO alliance can take and the options that NATO members can take. Remember, although NATO exists to offer its member states a strong commitment to collective defense, NATO nations would be well within their right to act in smaller groups or even by themselves to deter Russia in whatever ways they see fit. This is a concept that NATO members have already been playing around with in the form of the so-called Coalition of the Willing, a force that's meant to deploy in and around Ukraine in the event of a peace deal and prevent any future Russian attacks. Perhaps the NATO alliance can't agree on a collective response, but a smaller group of nations, let's say Britain, France, Germany, Finland, Poland, and NATO ally Canada, were willing to take action outside the auspices of NATO. Perhaps those nations were to solicit a non-binding resolution from NATO, signaling that while participating nations wouldn't be able to invoke Article 5 under certain conditions related to their group response, NATO provided those same nations with its informal blessing to do what they believe is necessary. In that world, there's no end to the creative possibilities that a non-NATO coalition could pursue. Perhaps those nations could, on their own, help Poland beef up its defenses with new construction around the Suwalki Gap, or it could operate in Ukrainian airspace in many of the ways we mentioned. Perhaps they could engage in their own buildup of ground troops or forward deployment of combat aircraft on the eastern edges of Polish or Baltic soil. Perhaps they could decide to lend a form of non-combat support to Ukraine, sending in small forces to guard over supply lines, for example, or to secure port cities away from the front line, like the critical city of Odessa, placing European forces into Ukraine but not making them a part of any active combat. Or perhaps those nations could directly acknowledge Russia's reliance on paramilitary groups and international troops from North Korea, beefing up its forces around the front lines, and decide that they are going to help establish a paramilitary or private mercenary company that would just so happen to recruit recently retired ex-soldiers and other highly motivated warfighters to protect the embassies, the consulates, the business and financial interests, and the citizens of those participating nations on Ukrainian soil. As we come to the conclusion of this episode, it's important to emphasize that we here at WarFronts, we are fully aware that we've just gone through a long list of things that aren't likely to happen. Honestly, given what we've observed from the NATO alliance, we wouldn't be the least bit surprised if Operation Eastern Sentry, insufficient as it may be, constitutes the entire NATO response to Russia's provocation. But we go through this list anyway, and we give a quick nod to all the other potential responses that we didn't even have time to discuss, because it's disingenuous and foolhardy for NATO to act as if those options don't exist. We said it in our prior coverage, and we'll say it again here. This is an intentionally vague provocation. It places NATO in a tough position, and it forces NATO to respond to Russia before the alliance's push for rearmament has really gotten started. But when else was Russia going to try something like this? Was Putin going to wait for NATO to get ready so that it could square up and invite Russia to take its best shot? We trust that you can see why that would be ridiculous, and we hope that NATO understands the same thing. Perhaps NATO will choose to respond decisively to what Russia's done. Perhaps the alliance will fold and signal to Putin that he can have his way with whatever NATO member state he likes. But if NATO's response turns out to be insufficient, then it wasn't because of a lack of options to stand up to Russia without inviting a continental war. Right now it can take action. It can do it rapidly and decisively to ensure that nothing like this happens again. It doesn't just have one answer at its disposal. It's got many. And it has the resources and the pretext to put any of them into action. If the alliance doesn't have the willpower, well, let's not mince words. Whatever horrors may transpire in the years to come, after NATO refused to grow a spine when it had the chance, those horrors were avoidable. They shouldn't happen, they don't need to happen, and if NATO plays its cards right in this moment, they won't happen. Thank you for watching.